When Mia returned from her 2-week trip to visit her parents, she expected to be greeted by the cheerful sight of her thriving vegetable garden, which she had carefully nurtured for nearly 3 years. Gardening was more than just a hobby for her. It was her therapy, her way of disconnecting from the constant buzz of work, and her proud contribution to sustainable living. Each plant carried a little story: the basil she grew from seeds her grandmother gave her, the tomato vines she trained to climb a wooden trellis, and the bell peppers she had learned to cultivate after many failed attempts. Before leaving, she had even asked her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, to occasionally water the plants, ensuring that the late summer sun wouldn't dry them out. But when Mia pulled into her driveway that evening, dragging her suitcase behind her, the sight that greeted her was nothing short of devastating. Her once lush garden had vanished entirely. The trellis lay broken near the back fence. The soil was unevenly raked over, as though someone had deliberately tried to erase all evidence of what had been there. And the only remnants of her hard work were a few splintered wooden stakes and the faint scent of basil leaves crushed into the dirt. Confused, she stood frozen for a moment, convinced she might have been at the wrong house. But the familiar cracks in her driveway and the wind chimes on her porch reminded her she was indeed home. Panic and anger began to collide inside her chest. After regaining her composure, Mia rushed over to her neighbor to find out what had happened. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been keeping a watchful eye on the property, didn't hesitate to explain. Karen, the ever-demanding president of the HOA, had come by one afternoon with a landscaping crew, claiming that the garden violated community aesthetic standards. She ordered the workers to pull everything out, even ignoring Mrs. Rodriguez's protests that the plants were legally permitted. Apparently, Karen insisted that vegetable gardens cheapened the neighborhood's image and took matters into her own hands while Mia was away, assuming no one would challenge her decision. Mia's hands trembled as she listened, her heart aching not only for the loss of her plants but for the sheer arrogance it took for someone to destroy what wasn't theirs. Instead of storming down the street to confront Karen, she forced herself to take a deep breath and think clearly. She grabbed her phone, snapped dozens of photos of the damage from every angle, then compared them with the photos she had taken just before leaving for her trip, the garden bursting with color, the tomatoes heavy on their vines, and the peppers shining like jewels in the sun. The stark contrast would make undeniable evidence. She then went online and refreshed her memory of the state's right to garden law, which had passed just a year prior, explicitly prohibiting HOAs from banning personal vegetable gardens on residential property. The more she read, the more her frustration transformed into determination. Karen hadn't just overstepped her authority, she had broken the law. Mia knew this wasn't just about a garden anymore. It was about her rights as a homeowner and the principle of standing up to bullies who thought they could control everything. With her evidence compiled, she drafted a detailed complaint to the state's housing authority, attaching photos, timelines, and even a written statement from Mrs. Rodriguez, though the pain of seeing her garden destroyed still stung deeply. Mia felt a spark of hope. If Karen thought she could silence her by ripping out her hard work, she was in for a surprise. Karen strutted around the neighborhood for weeks after the incident, proud of what she had done and convinced she had once again imposed her vision of perfection on the community. She smiled smugly at neighbors as she passed by, as if daring them to question her authority, and even made snide remarks about how much neater Mia's yard looked without that messy little farm. What Karen didn't realize, however, was that the wheels of accountability had already been set in motion. Mia's complaint, bolstered by photographic evidence, state law citations, and a signed witness statement, had been swiftly reviewed by the housing authority. They were no strangers to reports of overreaching HOA boards, and Karen's brazen destruction of protected personal property was a textbook violation. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the mail was being delivered, Karen happened to be standing by her immaculate front lawn, pruning her roses. She plucked the thick envelope from her mailbox without much thought, expecting another batch of HOA correspondence or dues-related paperwork, but as her eyes scanned the bold state letterhead, her face visibly blanched. The document spelled out in unambiguous terms that she had violated state law by ordering the destruction of a resident's garden, and the consequences were not a slap on the wrist. She had been fined several $1,000s, personally not the HOA as a whole, and she was warned that any future actions of this nature could result in civil lawsuits, injunctions, or even her removal from office. Witnesses later recalled that Karen froze in place, her pruning shears hanging limply at her side, as she reread the notice again and again, her lips trembling with disbelief. For years, she had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist disguised as community standards dictating the color of mailboxes, the height of hedges, and even the acceptable length of holiday decorations. Many residents had quietly endured her tyranny, too afraid or too weary to fight back. But this letter was different. It wasn't a neighbor challenging her. It was the state itself, and there was no wriggling out of it. Word spread quickly through the cul-de-sac. A few neighbors who had once been targets of Karen's nitpicking, like the Smiths, who had been scolded for leaving their recycling bins out too long, or the new gens, who had been fined for painting their shutters a slightly non-compliant shade of blue, couldn't help but exchange knowing smiles. For once, the enforcer had been forced to face consequences, and there was a certain poetic justice in the silence that surrounded her afterward. Meanwhile, Mia chose not to rub salt in the wound. She didn't gloat, didn't confront Karen directly, didn't even engage in the whispered gossip that now followed the HOA president wherever she went. Instead, she quietly set about reclaiming her space. With the support of neighbors who admired her courage, Mia rebuilt her garden from the ground up. Together they tilled the soil, replanted seedlings, and erected a sturdier trellis than before. Each sprout that broke through the earth felt like an act of defiance and resilience, a reminder that her voice and her rights mattered. When the first tomatoes ripened weeks later, she stood on her porch with a basket in her hands, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The garden had been destroyed once, but it had returned stronger, and so had she. As for Karen, her days of unchecked authority were over. She continued her duties as HOA president in name only. Her influence diminished and her confidence shaken. But whenever she walked past Mia's flourishing yard, she lowered her gaze and quickened her pace. The balance of power in the neighborhood had shifted, and everyone knew it.